Video games are great, aren't they? In fact, I'd say that right now they're better than ever before, all things considered. Which I don't think anybody would find to be a controversial statement to make, aside from hardcore fans of the NES era who hate how easy games have become. But are modern games really that easy? Well, I'd argue that today's most difficult games are actually harder than anything from the 8-bit era. And I'd even go one step further and say that most NES games were never truly that difficult to begin with. Why would I make such a bold claim? Well, pour yourself a glass of snake milk, tell your dad to pipe the frig down so you can enjoy the third best YouTube video ever made. Press the subscribe button if you haven't already, and allow me, the Ayatollah of rock and roll, Cameron, to tell you why modern games are harder and better than they used to be. Before you shove a tire iron up that mysterious hole in my lower back region because I'm trying to debunk a widely accepted myth, just hear me out. I'm not saying that finishing the most difficult NES games are more accomplishable than today's toughest games, all things considered. Because no matter how hard modern games get, there's usually never any doubt that you're gonna end up finishing it, whereas most people end up giving up on the toughest NES games. But the reasons people give up on those games has much less to do with actual difficulty and way more to do with games making a conscious effort to keep you busy for as long as possible. Back in the day, NES and Famicom cartridges could only hold so much information on them, and if a developer made a game that people were able to complete in one sitting, then the average person would have felt ripped off. So since making longer games was out of the question for a long time, most developers felt like the best way to make people feel like they got their money's worth was to provide tougher challenges to hide the fact that the games actually weren't very long. The 8-bit era is what I consider to be the very beginning of video games as we know them today. I know the Atari 2600 was the thing, and I'm sorry if this pisses like 4 people off, but 99% of those games don't hold up whatsoever. You just kinda did one thing over and over again for no real reason, like Hong Kong 97.
I can go and look at an old butter churn or a turn of the century car,
totally.
and I can appreciate the beauty of it. This is awful. This is just America on its knees.
So given that the 8-bit era was the true beginning of gaming, developers had to make a lot of mistakes before they could learn where the line between difficulty and being cheap was. Sadly though, most NES games fell into the latter category, and if you take the cheap factor away, most NES games really weren't all that difficult, because instead of providing challenges that take you a long time to make it through based on merit alone, most of them could be finished in a few tries. But the reason people thought they were so hard is because more often than not, extremely limited lives and checkpoints that sent you back far as hell made earning new attempts way more frustrating than it needed to be. Some games had tasks that were just flat out hard no matter how many times you tried. And yeah, those games in particular might be harder than anything you could play today. But when I'm talking about difficult games from the NES era, I'm mainly talking about the ones that were fun. Like, Mega Man 1's technically the hardest in the series due to a lack of E-tanks and shit that just doesn't make sense, like moving platforms that have no pattern. But most would agree that it's the least fun Mega Man game as well. And don't even get me started on Ghosts and Goblins where you have to beat the game twice just to get the true ending. They weren't even subtle about artificially inflating the playtime in that one. And even games that didn't have a whole lot of cheap bullshit in them still had checkpoints that sent you back far as hell. But instead of being required to complete tasks that are insanely difficult, you usually just had to redo a bunch of things that were moderately difficult over and over again to earn another opportunity at something that might be kinda hard. But the frustration comes from being sent back so far if you fail, rather than the actual part you're having trouble with. And in my opinion, this kind of frustration does not equate to fun. And I don't feel that way because I'm incapable of beating these kinds of games either. I haven't finished every difficult NES game ever made, but I've beaten every Mega Man game numerous times, as well as Ninja Gaiden, the first 2 Zeldas, Kid Icarus, and a few others as well, all on actual cartridges without cheats. And I definitely felt a sense of accomplishment from it, so it's not that I'm against challenge. I just think there's better ways to go about it than punishing the player with excessive repetition. And I think Celeste is the perfect way to make games way harder without being a dick about it. A common complaint that's made about modern games being too easy is that pretty much everything nowadays gives you unlimited lives and continues. But I see lives and continues as one of those things that developers have just been doing for decades for no other reason than habit, before legendary game developer Dixon Butts realized that there were better ways. And I don't really see how getting rid of lives makes games easier anyway. Cause first of all, even games that technically had lives like Mega Man gave you unlimited continues anyway, so scrapping the entire system's really not all that groundbreaking. And I'd argue that dying in Shovel Knight has more consequences anyway, since you might lose your booty if you can't recollect it. It's still not as bad as having to restart the entire game from the beginning, but Shovel Knight's got a little more class than to pull a dick move like that. But even if you don't think Shovel Knight's that hard, I don't think there's any denying that Celeste is a trillion times harder than any NES game. And I'd go as far as to say it's more fun as well, because rather than sending you back to the beginning of a stage or title screen after failing a handful of times, you get to try everything as many times as you want and you're never forced to redo too much over and over again. This lets developers really push challenge to the limits without making a game feel repetitive, which cuts down on the bad bad kind of frustration. It's like the game's confident enough in its difficulty that it's daring you to try as many times as you want by essentially giving you save states. But if you play NES games with save states, then even the most difficult tasks aren't comparable to anything in Celeste. I'm sure there's a few old school gamers watching this who can't wait to see my skinny fat ass in public for mentioning save states in NES games. But being forced to restart games all the way from the beginning after a handful of mistakes just isn't very fun, nor is it truly challenging. And regardless of what you might think, save states weren't added to retro game services and compilations to make them easier necessarily. They were designed to fix all the cheap bullshit that was designed to keep you busy back in an era where nobody really had anything better to do anyway. I'd agree that abusing save states to where you're using it after every move robs you a challenge, but when used responsibly, it just saves you time and allows you to play more games. Even if you think unlimited lives and reasonable checkpoints make games too easy though, then you could just find other ways to make games harder, like resetting it if you die or something. But don't try to pretend the way you grew up with is better just because it's what you're used to. It's okay to have your preferences, but on top of the actual challenges within games being harder than they were before, modern games are more accessible at the same time. And whenever someone tells me they don't play video games, I honestly feel bad for them. And even though I feel personally offended when games offer to hold my hand through certain sections after I die too much, I still think this optional help in modern games is a good thing. Because if it leads to more people getting into video games like Shane's grandfather did recently, then what's the harm? Video games are supposed to be fun after all, and the original reason they caught on in the first place was because of people who didn't want to play sports. So I've got a pretty hard time understanding why some people want to turn all of gaming into a serious competitive thing. And I have no problem with competitive gaming at all. I'm just saying there's room for everybody, so don't shame people because they don't play the same way as you. It'd be like if NBA players went to local basketball courts and shamed people for having fun and not trying to be the best in the world. And look, I'm definitely not saying that difficulty in games is a bad thing. I think overcoming challenges and growing is one of the best parts of gaming, but there's nothing wrong with having options and giving everybody a chance to enjoy one of the best things in the world. So even if you prefer the heat in your games to be cranked up, I still don't see how you could argue that less repetition doesn't make games better when the actual challenges are harder than ever before. Because having to constantly do the same thing over and over again after a few mistakes doesn't make games harder. It just gives you the illusion of difficulty by wasting your time. But I'll tell you two people who don't waste time when taking care of business are today's patrons of the day, Aaron Ayala and Andrew Lawler. Or if you'd rather show support by picking a shirt or mug up, then send pictures of videos of you rocking it to make a cameo like these badasses right here. What do you think though, are modern games really more difficult than NES games? Or do you think infrequent checkpoints and limited lives counts as difficulty? Either way, let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll try my goddamnedest to respond to everybody. And if you want to help this channel grow, then simply liking and sharing goes a long way. My name's Cameron, and I'll see you next time.
So I want to say thank you to your loyalty, thank you for your support.